live streamers. Yeah, I think so. Hello and welcome to Demos. My name is Ben Glover. I'm the head of social policy here, which basically means I work on public services and public service reform. Thanks for coming along on is it the hottest day of the year officially? Something like that, to talk about politics and policy. It's very good use of your time, I'm sure. This event is part of Demos's Public Services 2030 network. We host monthly events like these to talk about issues relating to public services and public service reform. I want to thank our 4 excellent funders who allow this work to be possible. They are SIPFA, the WEA, the Institute of Employability Professionals, and Reed in partnership. Very grateful for their support. I'm delighted to have pretty much a packed room and a great panel this evening. We will finish promptly at 6:15 p.m. so you can go and catch the rest of the sun. And we're going to do some opening remarks from the panelists and then plenty of time for Q&A. So what are we talking about? Last time we did one of these events, since the last time we did one of these events, we've got a new government. It's probably too early to say exactly what its agenda is going to look like for public services and reform, but we're going to try and take a little bit of a look at that tonight. And also, more importantly, ask what should the new government's agenda be on public services and public service reform. I'm delighted to have 3 great guest speakers with us tonight. To my left, we have Professor Nick Pearce. Nick is the director of the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Bath and formerly the director of the IPPR think tank. He's also worked in the number 10 policy unit where he was head of policy and worked under Gordon Brown. Great to have you with us, Nick. To Nick's left, we have Halima Khan. Halima has been a senior official in national, regional and local government, working in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, Greater London, the GLA, and Camden Council. She is a senior advisor at PPL and an affiliated researcher at the Bennett Institute at the University of Cambridge, and has recently got some job news today, which is all public now. So that's very exciting. And Halima from November will be the chief executive of the Paul Hamlin Foundation. Great to have you with us, Halima. Thank you. To Halima's left, we have Professor Catherine Needham. Catherine is Professor of Public Policy and Public Management at the University of Birmingham, where her research focuses on social care. She's also working with Demos on our Future Public Services Task Force as a policy advisor. I'm very grateful for all of her advice and wisdom. So thank you, Catherine. Back to the question for tonight's event. What should be the new government's priorities for public services and reform? We're going to have opening remarks from our 3 speakers and then plenty of time for Q&A. Nick, over to you. And we've got to speak into this.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Ben. And it's a pleasure to be here and to talk about these very important questions on the future of public services. I want to start with the sort of first challenge, the first task, the first priority for the newly elected government, which is obviously the funding of public services and the securing and stabilising of the funding of public services after a period of austerity, particularly outside the protected services like the NHS, in things like the courts, the NHS, local government, prisons, and so on. And yesterday's announcement by Rachel Reeves was clearly the sort of first step in that. It was a very political occasion, as you would expect, but it also substantively said some important things about how this government's going to approach the funding of public services. Firstly, she said there will be a 1-year settlement at the next budget in October. That is to cover the year 2025-6, and not to do a full spending review for the 3 years thereafter in the sort of 3 months before the budget. I think that's the right approach. I think Labour has got a lot of areas where its policies are yet to be worked through. It's doing a lot of reviews, a lot of areas where you wouldn't know the framework of policy that you wanted to fund if you sought to approach. I think to make good on the commitment that there'll be no austerity, no further austerity, does require that all departments at a minimum have flat real settlements, that is no real terms cuts. That's particularly important for those services that I mentioned, the courts, prisons, local government, and so on. And of course, we have implied increases now in funding for education, health, and so on, because of the acceptance of the pay review body awards yesterday. And It's also very important, I think, to protect public capital investment if we're thinking about the productivity of our public services, not just to secure day-to-day resource spending, but to think about the future profile of public capital in things like the NHS, but also across services where only capital investment will enable us to lift productivity in the public sector. I think one of the other big things that was sent as a signal by yesterday's announcement was a sort of electoral coalition that underpins the Labour government. It chose to ask better off pensioners to give up their winter fuel allowances, but chose to fully fund the pay awards for the public sector. That says something about the kind of electoral coalition that has brought Labour to power. But it also suggests, I think, that there will be a kind of an approach to public sector workers, which is more ameliorative, that wants to work with them as partners in repairing and renewing the public sector. That is a different kind of tone and posture to the one that perhaps was typical of the last Labour government, of the sort of new Labour, new public management, choice and competition, thinking of public sector workers much more as a producer interest. Posture towards the public sector workers and the workforce has been much more one of partnership, of working together to repair and restore the public services. And perhaps that's inevitable given the inheritance, given how badly run down so many of those services were. I don't think, however, that there is to come to Ben's point, there is a single overarching narrative or vision for the public services under this Labour government. There are different discourses at work in what is being talked about in different departments. Perhaps if anything sort of gives it a sort of unity, it's the idea of mission government. But as far as I can see, that's mostly about how Whitehall is configured. It's mostly about how the cabinet is serviced, the creation of mission boards and so on. And there's a danger that rather than becoming a new approach to governing, it becomes just a sort of reheated new public management. Lots more targets, indicators, lots of sort of delivery, mission delivery units, and all of the rest of it, rather than an approach to public services which seeks to prioritize, which seeks to devolve, to decentralize, to engage communities and public sector workers in those services. So I think if there is anything that's kind of bringing together how the Labour government's approaching these issues, it is through mission government, but there are some risks with that, and that needs a lot of careful thought. I'll just finish on some ways forward. Well, firstly, there's some big unfinished business in public services. Social care is preeminent amongst those. No government in the last 30 years has solved, fixed, reformed our social care system. And part of yesterday's announcement was to put off the implementation of the Dilnot reforms once again. So that is a huge piece of unfinished business. And we have to think across our public services at where over the next 5-10 years, particularly if we're thinking of a decade of renewal, some of these kind of main priorities for service reform and improvement need to be, and social care is right up there for me. At the same time, I think there should be an approach which liberates experimentation and innovation. I think the government should license many more experiments in public service delivery and design at the local level to enable and facilitate the metro mayors and others to engage in that kind of experimentation. We have too little of that, and it's often from that incremental experimentation that you then build up models for future public service provision. I think the work that Demos has done recently on participatory democracy and on deliberation, the engagement of the public, is an area, again, where I would like to see the government license more, encourage more experimentation. That's been happening a lot in municipal government across Europe, in other parts of the world, a little bit here in the local government level. But for example, why shouldn't we see a permanent citizens' assembly alongside the Greater Manchester Combined Authority? Why shouldn't we see more participatory budgeting? That was a sort of subaltern discourse in the last Labour government associated with people like David Blunkett and Hazel Blears and others. But we should be thinking more about that, about saying let's build a strand of public participation and engagement which can run through our public services in the coming years. And then my final point is just on institutions, and it relates a little bit to the work on sort of relational governance that I know Catherine will talk about. The last Labour government did not give enough thought to how it would, if you like, house its public service aspirations within institutions, creating new institutions and embedding them. Too much was dependent on transactional services and on tax and benefit transfers, frankly. Those are important. I mean, they're big parts of the welfare state. But a lot more thought needs to be given to how you embed your aspirations in institutions in which you can live a common life, in which people have an interest and a stake, in which people are employed as public sector workers, and which can have a better chance of enduring when the next round of cuts comes along. So just to give an example of that on child poverty, of course, child poverty is about income. Of course, the two-child limit should be got rid of. Of course, we need to improve the universal credit allocations to families with children. But at the same time, we should be thinking of a decade-long process of consolidating children's centres in every community and integrating health and child services in those centres, engaging parents in them, ensuring that they are there as a core institutional embodiment of a new frontier in the welfare state, and that your child poverty strategy does not just rely on tax and benefit transfers. So that's one example. There are many others that can be given, consolidating devolution to combined authorities and deepening that, giving them more powers and more tax raising responsibility, thinking about bodies like the Low Pay Commission, deepening those. So creating new institutions, embedding and deepening others, and making sure that your statecraft and your approach to public services has that in mind, particularly if you're thinking of a decade-long project. So that would be one of the things I would want to leave with you as a thought for approaching these questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Are we ready?
Great, yeah. So we might be at risk of violently agreeing with one another. So, but I think I think my remarks will complement what Nick said. So, yes, I think we need to start by recognising the state that we're in terms of the mess in terms of public finances and the hollowing out of public services. And so, recovery and renewal will take time. In fact, a piece of work I did last year with IPPR called Great Government, we modelled rates of improvement in public services. And for instance, for Crown Court backlogs, there are a lot of backlogs in our court system. So if those backlogs were to improve at the same rate that they were improving between 2014 and 19, it would take until 2033 just to get back to pre-pandemic levels. So that's quite sobering if you sort of, and we did the same with elective waiting lists and other areas of public services. So it all points to at least an 8 to 10 plus year kind of period of recovery. And that's even, comparing with periods of time where there was greater levels of investments in some cases. So that, leads to the government needing to manage expectations, which I think it is trying to do. I think it also points to needing both investment and reform. And I think it's very clear that we do need both. Reform alone isn't going to be enough without investment, but equally, even if investment were to be available, we shouldn't be pouring it back into old models of public services which have been demonstrated to be not fit for purpose. So we do need to have both reform and investment. And as Nick said, I think it's really important that at this very challenging moment that we do try to resist some of sort of a return to new public management and the limitations of new public management. So the agenda of reform itself needs to be renewed. And I think that's the sort of conversation really that we're having this afternoon. So some thoughts on that. So I think I've been really heartened to hear this administration's commitment to prevention. So let's hope that continues. I think it does need real top level, high political commitment and boldness if we're going to avoid what I sometimes refer to as a kind of generational failure to make more progress on prevention from 2000 and onwards. And we know that things would be better if we could prevent crises from happening in the first place. We know that there is an enormous amount of what you might call failure demand in the existing system. So in other words, demand for public services generated by things not being resolved, by people being ping-ponged around the system. We know that, we can see it. And we know that there are these incredibly inefficient vertical silos of public services which are not fit for purpose because they're not resolving issues. They are simply kind of taking a piecemeal approach to an issue that's much more complicated, that, you know, that will sort of, we can kind of illustrate a bit in a moment. So prevention, I think, needs to remain part of the government's priorities. And that's going to be tough because there's always going to be immediate stuff that's going to be a distraction. So that is going to take massive political commitment if that's to survive. I think secondly, another thing I think I'd be really good to see would be what I've been calling putting the social back into social policy. So it's a sort of reflection really onto some of the limitations, if you like, of a new public management approach, where citizens are treated like sort of pieces on a chessboard, being moved around, being incentivized to do this, told to queue up there, you know, tick box, you know, form filling there, and recognizing that instead the vital role of high trust relationships in people's lives as a way to support them to take positive steps forward, knowing that, you know, something like getting a job or losing weight or quitting drugs, all of those things are incredibly difficult things to do, even if you've got, you know, significant social and economic resources. So obviously the people that are most in need of that support have often, you know, themselves experienced adverse childhood experiences. They've then had cumulative impacts of more traumatic experiences, including living in poverty and in precarious living conditions. So recognizing the vital importance of a high trust relationship in that kind of context, in which people can build trust with somebody, and through that relationship can be supported to take positive steps to do something as difficult as losing weight or quitting drugs, I think needs to be, again, part of understanding the role of public services in people's lives and how those can be, you know, much more successful really at addressing the issues that they need to address. And then I think thirdly, I think it would be fantastic to see a sort of a recognition of the importance of productivity in public services and taking that seriously. I mean, public services take up a significant proportion of GDP. They need to be treated as, you know, seriously as we treat other parts of the economy. But I think we need to rethink productivity to be much more than this kind of very narrow kind of understanding of kind of efficiency and a sort of what can be a kind of a race to the bottom in terms of kind of price and therefore quality often, and a much more expansive understanding of productivity that has workforce at the center of that. And I think there's strong evidence that when you have a really engaged, really motivated workforce that feels valued and supported, that is a major driver of productivity, because, you know, our workforce is one of our major assets. And it's been great to see this administration prioritizing these pay deals. I think that's a real recognition of the importance of workforce. And I think secondly, alongside that, as we kind of expand our understanding of productivity, as I say, this move away from just narrow efficiency to more sort of an understanding of efficacy, you know, is this the right thing to be doing? Back to these kind of vertical silos that don't really resolve people's issues. Again, taking a citizen perspective is often one of the most powerful ways of circumventing those silos, because as soon as you operate on the basis of what does this person need to support them to live the best life they can live, then very naturally you get a much more seamless kind of connection between housing and care and childcare and employment, because that's how we all live our lives. And so I think that's the power of taking a citizen-based perspective, which is much easier to do at the local level. So again, I would agree that I think a commitment to devolution, to subsidiarity, all the way down to citizens. And I agree with the point about the real kind of value of citizen participation and all kinds of creativity I think we can bring to that. But I think a sort of a next generation, if you like, of powers and resources at the local and regional level, I think is necessary to sort of achieve this vision of public services. So I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. And Halima, it's great that you finished on sort of devolution, because that's where I want to start. So in a rather gloomy day yesterday, it was good to see in some of the accompanying documentation an emphasis on increasing devolution and local integration of services. Because as Nick said, if mission-oriented government is going to be a success, it needs to mean more than the mission boards in Whitehall, and it's got to engage with the local. Some of that's about engaging citizens in a different way, and it's great that Demos has been active in this space. And it's also been really heartening to see the focus on devolution already so far in the new government. The new intake of Labour MPs has got very strong representation from former council leaders, including the former chair of the Local Government Association. I believe the first time that's ever happened that they've moved into being an MP. The Prime Minister's already met with the Metro mayors and promised further devolution. We've got place-based budgets are back on the agenda. Remember Total Place, anybody? And so it's great that things are already progressing in some combined authority areas. But I think it's really important to acknowledge the fragility of local government. Local government is spending 10 to 15% less than it was in 2010. It's really limping along, and I think in some cases, like my own city of Birmingham, it's effectively fallen over. Across the sector, we know that the cuts have fallen particularly harshly on services like youth, transport, leisure, housing, highways, and that only in adult and children's social care has spending increased, and even then not enough to meet demand. All of this has really adversely affected the strategic capacity of the sector. So there's partly, I think, about the kind of the appetite and the capability of local government to really work effectively and how we kind of bolster that. We know some of what needs to be done. So we know that we need Labour to deliver on the manifesto promise of a multi-year financial settlement for local government. And again, that pertains to the announcements yesterday and how that will fit with a kind of the one-year plan. I think there needs to be a much clearer sense that everybody has access to a re-energised and freed up devolved sector. So at the moment, only half the population live in areas with devolution deals. So rural counties in particular risk being left behind in so-called devolution deserts. So we need to be thinking about, whilst we don't necessarily need a kind of cookie cutter one size fits all for devolution, we do need to recognise that there's lots of places currently left out of things like the kind of place-based budgeting that some of these trailblazer areas already have access to. We need to recognise that local government has its own electoral legitimacy, that it's not there to do the bidding of central government and it's not there to be done to. So we need to make sure that in initiatives such as integrated care systems, we're not leaving out that local political voice in a kind of much more sort of technocratic approach, which I think has been a risk around integrated care systems. We need to learn from some of the great innovation in the sector already about how to do public services differently. So we can think about the liberated method in Gateshead, about mission-oriented procurement in Camden, at the Wigan deal. And it's interesting to note that a lot of these things are quite structure light. And I'm still thinking about Nick's point about we need to institutionalise, because what I've got in my notes is we need to not emphasise structures too much. We need to just sort of get on and think about relationships and processes. But yeah, so I think that's something to reflect on, because the value of having those sort of building-based services in areas is really important. But nonetheless, I think in terms of public service reform, there is a danger in making it all about structures and not about culture and not about relationships. So we need to learn from the places that are doing this well, because we know that learning is a really key part of effective system change. So things like human learning systems, which some of you will be familiar with, are really helpful here about how we go about redesigning public services by building learning in as we go. And I think particularly given the problem facing regulatory bodies like Ofsted, and in particular at the moment, the Care Quality Commission, we need to get better at using data to learn rather than to hold accountable and punish, as we see too often. I really hope as well that the new government will be receptive to learning from the devolved nations. So this devolution agenda is not just about England, and our conversation shouldn't just be about England. We know that some of the UK's smaller nations have moved forward in some of the areas that Labour needs to prioritise. So, for example, if Labour wants to create a national care service, and I really hope it still does, despite the announcement yesterday about the care cap, then it would do well to look to Scotland. So in Scotland, the SNP's plans for a national care service, I think, are a real great example of how not to do this. So there's been lots of great social care legislation in Scotland, and I think we can look for lots of sort of positive examples there. They've tried and they've got free personal care, and we can see there that has lots of benefits, but it does also take your eye off prevention. They have care worker registration. There's been a change to carers allowance to make it more general, to bring it into line with job seekers allowance. So lots of great stuff has happened in Scotland and some in Wales as well. But what we saw with Scotland's proposals for a national care service, I think, was a real high watermark of the SNP's centralisation and mission creep. So the proposals which came out stripped out the role of local government in social care entirely and expanded the national care service to include elements of GP practice and the family courts. And what that managed to do was unite a huge range of very varied opponents against a national care service. And they've been able to rally very effectively against it. And the SNPs had to retreat and effectively have a rethink about what this national care service could be. So I think there's lots of potential kind of learning there about not so much the kind of the what of public service priorities, but also the how. So the kind of some of the sort of statecraft that Nick mentioned. And so it's important then in terms of thinking about ways forward to not only look forward to the kind of missions of the future, but also backwards and outwards to the places that should have been doing these things and trying to do things differently. And some of that can tell us not just what to change, but how and how not to make change.
Great reflections, thank you. I'm going to abuse my position as chair to ask a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the floor. I don't know who wants to go first on this, but the question of sequencing is something I'm really interested in exploring. It relates, I think, to what you've all spoken about, particularly what you set out, Nick, around there perhaps being or perhaps not being a sort of prioritization process around refunding and stabilization and then moving on to reform, or do you think it's actually possible to be trying to tackle these things head on together? And there is a bit of interesting language which panelists have spoken about in the spending audit published yesterday by the Treasury, which sort of suggests there is a interest post the 1 year rollover to try to kind of essentially tie the things together. So you might be putting additional money in and doing the reform. So yeah, what do you think about that? And should we be, or should, because some people will say, I disagree with these people, but, some people will say, this government really should just be sort of spending the next 4 or 5 years stabilizing things. And the idea of reform is just for the birds, everything's on fire and we can't really think about changing stuff. So what do people think about that?
Yeah, well, I do think that, beyond the budget and the 1 year allocation, the spending review, spending reviews are always the processes in Whitehall which drive, a lot of your policy change. And particularly in constrained fiscal circumstances of the kind we have now, some of the big things that are going to happen in this Parliament will be done, under the aegis of the spending review, comprehensive spending review. So next, spring, summer, the announcement of that. I think there are some things which, are system reforms that you have to undertake just to stabilise. So, Catherine mentioned local government. We have a real problem in our public spending and public services that we dump cost savings into different services. They often end up in local government. Local government's the sort of repository of cuts elsewhere. They find their way through homelessness, through, families needing temporary accommodation, through children needing safeguarding, lots of things where you cut elsewhere. If you cut DWP benefits, for example, end up in local government, or if you cut support for asylum seekers and refugees, they end up homeless in local government, etc. So one of the features of thinking, and there was a reference to this in the Treasury papers yesterday, about thinking systemically about public services at a local level, is you can look at those flows of funding and look at them in a systemic way, not just to sort of repair the damage in local government, but to think about how you reconfigure who's doing what and where the money goes. So it's a reform task, if you like. And I think the spending review should do something like that. Actually, I think there should be a sort of local public services spending review process, a joined up review, alongside others, for example, on child poverty. So that's one issue. I think it's sort of inevitable that you'll get reform, even though you're doing a sort of repair and stabilisation job, particularly through the spending review. And then something on the other point on sequencing about sort of something like child poverty, I think, and this is true of other areas where you're trying to say, we have said consistently we need a decade there needs to be a decade of renewal and reform across the economy and public services, and you use that kind of time horizon to then think about sequencing and changing how you reform things. So, for example, in child poverty in the early years, we've got a big expansion of funded entitlements to free childcare places. We haven't tied that yet to a sense that over the next decade, all of your funding for early years will come through the supply side instead of through universal credit and tax reliefs as well. We haven't said there will be a kind of public sector brigading and organising of early years services, whether through children's centres or not. We've said, there are different providers. There hasn't been a view taken on those sorts of things in the public sector. And at what point you would sequence the further development of entitlements. So one of the ways of thinking of sort of over a decade is to think, okay, we are going to be having a kind of 10-year plus. We had that in the past with the children's plan, with the 10-year health plan, and so on. But I think it needs a lot more sort of serious thought. And as I say, I think the spending review can be a driver of that. Other things like the Child Poverty Task Force can be a driver of that, and there'll be other elements in other parts of the public sector.
So I think that's very, very helpful. I think another sort of way of looking at it is that I think some things can be put in place, if you like, that's for reforming the state to be able to do the task of recovery. And I think we're seeing some of that in how these sort of missions are being set up. I think the commitment to some long-term reform plans. Obviously, there's a sort of 10-year plan that will be in for health. We're seeing the beginnings of some longer-term funding settlements. We're beginning to see sort of signs of local and regional government being somewhat at the table in terms of some decision making. So I think all of that is tremendously positive and suggests that the intent of this administration is to genuinely think for the long term as well as address the immediate issues. I think it's, to state the obvious, is going to be so incredibly difficult because, let's just take NHS waiting times. It's clear why they need to be tackled, both in terms of people's health, but also from a kind of political imperative point of view. And yet that task in itself, as we know from the early 2000s, is so demanding. It can easily just kind of capture an enormous amount of energy and attention within the health system in a way that, going back to that point about the kind of failure of prevention in the sort of previous 20 years, it could easily do the same thing again because it just sucks in so much energy. And so, I think, there's no easy answers through this, but I guess, again, I'm kind of heartened with these early signs of an administration that seems to be able to, at least at this point in time, to think in terms of the immediate stabilisation and in terms of the building blocks for the longer term. I think a couple of other things it would be great to see, which I don't think has been sort of clear so far. I completely agree on this point about kind of learning and improvement. And I think it would be fantastic to see at some point some commitments to building the capacity around public services to learn and improve. And that being very much a kind of learning and improving in context in local places. So again, it's sort of hand in hand with the devolution agenda in my mind. And then I think another thing would be fantastic to sort of build in would be a commitment to build sort of equipping and building the leadership capacity in public services, back to this point that, that has been massively hollowed out. So those would be some sort of positive signs, if you like.
Thanks. And I think sequencing is partly a question about tactics, about how you get things done. And so on social care, for example, I think there is a danger in sort of waiting to sort of the sort of perfectionism of the National Care Service. We'll just wait until we've kind of got it ready to sort of roll out a kind of new beverage moment, because that moment is not coming. And I think that's one of the reasons I was particularly dismayed about the care cap being shelved yesterday, is because we just need to start and we just need to kind of think about this. This is a staged series of reforms and get the sequencing right. So if you live in Wales, for example, they've already increased their means test for social care. They've already put a weekly cap on home care. And I think in England, we've just not done anything because we've got this kind of sense that we need to kind of get it all right. So I think sequencing is also partly about thinking about the benefits of incrementalism rather than the kind of big bang.
Thank you. Very good reflections. Kind of picking up from that, the question of does the government need a vision for public service reform? I mean, I work at a think tank. I'm sort of in the business of producing these sort of things, so I don't want to do myself too much out of a job. I should say, you know, through our public services task force, we've set out a vision called Liberated Public Services, which draws on the liberated method up in Gateshead that panelists have spoken about. Nick, I know you said, you know, there are potentially a couple of different things in the mix, but not necessarily a kind of dominant view. Do you think that will hold back the government's attempt to drive public service reform, or is having a mix of intellectual currents fine, and or a vision's nonsense and we should just be pragmatically putting one brick in front of the other and working in that way, as Starmer's approach is sometimes described?
Yeah.
Any takers?
Well, I do think. I mean, I do think Starmer is pragmatic about these things. You know, and the upside of that is you can do incremental change. You can flex up what you're doing. You can do different things at different paces. The downside is that Whitehall doesn't have a sense of, you know, overall direction, and that you're not giving, you know, strong signals to different departments. And people don't understand kind of where they fit in. And I suppose mission government is supposed to give people that sense of a shared endeavour. And I know from experience, working in Number 10, that it can be very, very hard, actually, if, you know, cabinet ministers don't kind of intuitively feel where the Prime Minister wants them to go in these sorts of areas. But I think, you know, looking at it, I mean, you know, the Labour manifesto majored much more on growth, on the net zero transition, far less on the welfare state and public services. That's just what the balance was. And that reflects our recent history. It reflects the kind of perspectives taken by the Labour leadership. And so I think that the likelihood is that we'll have a sort of a different set of discourses at play, different cabinet ministers doing somewhat different things. And from that will emerge, you know, a process and processes of reform over time, which, you know, will be shaped in sort of different ways. And, you know, hopefully prevention will have a bigger place, hopefully total place, local integration, these sorts of things will come through, and those sorts of commitments will emerge. But I suspect, yeah, that we're not I don't think we're in a position now where we'll have a kind of strategy unit style publication on the government's approach to public service reform that will then kind of just be sort of rolled out through people's speeches and policy decisions. I think that's quite unlikely.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, particularly from a think tank. So you get marks for asking the question. Yeah, I think similarly. I think, you know, well, in just looking at the sort of literature on public management, we are technically in this kind of post new public management limbo. We're in kind of post NPM flux. So in a way, it might also not be that much of a surprise if we didn't have a kind of all singing, all dancing, perfectly watertight narrative, and that things are a bit more horses for courses, a bit more pragmatic, a bit more of a mixed economy of reform, perhaps. As I said before, there's a risk that the NPM stuff just sucks everything else into it. But so you could imagine, so that is sort of somewhat consistent, if you like, with this sort of, as you say, these wider intellectual currents that are going on. And in a way, I'm sort of also quite, up to a point, quite attracted with the just do it kind of approach. Just do a bunch of reform, and then it might be, as you say, that then from some action a narrative can then much more naturally emerge that might then be more powerful, rather than let's have the speech and the speech is going to make everything happen, because we know that that's not the case. So
yeah, I mean, I think there's, clearly the number of people who care about the whole kind of mission agenda is limited to people in this room and maybe like another 100. So, you know, the kinds of narratives we're talking about here are not kind of mass narratives. I think there's some learning from Biden in the kind of the limits of sort of deliverology, and you can kind of do a good job, but you've also got to inspire. So it's not clear, I guess, where that kind of inspiration will come, but, you know, hopefully it will come on the back of the kind of the growth and the visibility of improvements in people's lives.
Very interesting reflections. Do you think that, I guess, this is something that we sort of spend quite a lot of time talking about here. Like Blair, kind of a New Labour put a big, or at least reading it, I was quite young at the time. Reading that stuff, there was a big, clear sell to the public. They were trying to speak directly. I mean, Blair probably maybe overestimated his ability to speak directly with the public, but there was, it was something which you could imagine a politician trying to communicate, potentially even on a doorstep, in a way which mission-led government is more, feels like more of an internal or a kind of elite audience-facing thing. I don't know if that's not particularly fair. Labour did talk about missions in the public-facing way, but do you think basically the question here, which I'm about to get to, is does public service reform in government need that public-facing story, or do you think you can kind of get on behind the scenes and do this stuff? And it's something I've asked people who've done reform locally, and you hear quite different things. Some people say, no, actually, we just kind of quietly got on with this on the background, and on the doorstep we talked about jobs, housing, better services. Or you speak to other people who've done reform on the ground, and they say, actually, our kind of vision and narrative for reform is front and center in the way that we all knock on doors on the weekend. Like, do you think there's something in that, anyone? Bit of a hard question, bit of a rambly question. Catherine, go on.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose just to say that whose vision is it? Is it local government's vision? Is it the West Midlands Combined Authority's vision? Is it central government's vision? Who is cutting through? So, some of the relatively sort of successful interventions recently have been things like the Wigan deal, where it was about sort of building people's sense of kind of a shared agenda in a place and a sort of meaningful geography. So I suppose that maybe that's more achievable and clearly much more difficult to do it for. Well, is it the UK? Is it England? Like, what is the kind of even the unit that you're talking about, kind of trying to bring together at the national level?
And yeah, I wonder if it's also sort of a little bit of a reflection of the moment that we're in, kind of the comparison back with Blair and that kind of retail offer, if you like. Because if you think about the depths to which kind of trust has fallen and the extent to which people are thinking, well, they're all the same, that is a quite, a kind of refrain you often hear when people talk about politicians, that whether that's also sort of shaping things, if you like. I'm also with Catherine on the previous point of, the narrative. We know narrative is so important for all of us as human beings to make sense of the world. Stories, narrative, they are really important. I guess the question, I think, is whether that story needs to be about public services or whether it can be about people's lives, living fulfilling lives, being part of the country, the other forms of identity and belonging and sense of togetherness, whether it or not it needs to be about public services. And I wonder whether that's a different way of thinking about the same thing.
Cool. I think we are going to open it up to the floor, unless anyone's got anything else. Are we? I don't know. What's the situation with the mics? Are we roving around? Anyone? Do I need to pass the mic? Basically, yeah, that's the question. I'll just pass the mic to you. Do you want to just introduce yourself and say your name?
I will do. Thank you very much. My name is Martin Lejeune. The organisation is Foretold, which is a policy consultancy, Brussels and London. And I wanted to come back to the decision which made to meet the pay settlements in full, which obviously was a discretion. They're clearly defensible in their own terms. I wondered if the panel were disappointed that that nothing was attached to them in terms of ways of working, efficiency, productivity, because they were, particularly in the case of the junior doctors, quite generous settlements. And to echo the point that Nick made about public capital, because one of the sacrificial victims for those pay settlements were indeed hospitals, roads, rail investment. So you're giving with one hand and perhaps taking away with the other. I'd be very interested in your comments on the relationship between pay and investment. Thank you.
A great two-part question. So firstly, was it a mistake not to tie the fairly generous pay awards to some kind of wider changes? And secondly, if at the same time you're cutting capital spending, is that robbing with one hand and taking from the other? Anyone want to kick us off?
Well, the pay review body awards come with an expectation that some of the cost is absorbed by the services. They're not fully funded. So schools, for example, will have to find 2% of the efficiencies are implied by the settlement being 5.5%. They didn't come with any kind of negotiated process of changes in workforce practice or changes in staffing and all those sorts of things. You couldn't do that, frankly, in a matter of weeks coming into government. All those things take a long time to negotiate. I think the sort of implied payoff is you don't go on strike. I mean, that's basically, a Labour government once comes in and wants to stop industrial action in the public services because it knows that says to the world things don't work anymore. There was a strong public view that was the case, but also that you lose lots of resource, time, and effort if you've got strike action. So you want to get it stopped. So that for me is probably where the main sort of trade-off came in. On the point of investment, as a country, we absolutely have to increase our public and private investment. There's absolutely no way that we can improve our living standards, fund the public services we want in the future without increases in investment. And that has to be in the public as well as in the private sector. I am not somebody that believes that the kind of AI fairy is going to come and do all this for you. If you just invest in AI, then you can get out of jail free with all your public spending pressures and all the difficult decisions that are coming on tax, for example. But I do think that there is a big role for thinking hard about capital investment. And what I suppose the sort of positive take on the pausing on the hospital building program is that there might actually be better priorities for public capital investment in the NHS and in community services. So if you want to shift much more into integrated care services in the community, into prevention, into child health, all of those things, there may be better investment priorities for you to do that.
Thank you.
I think I'd only just add that I think it does feel like we're beginning to be in a better place in terms of the case for investment on things like health for prosperity. So that feels quite positive in terms of where the debate has got to. We haven't yet, we are yet to see that, if you like, translate into government action, but creating these new cases for investment and creating new connections between different parts of the economy and other things, I think is positive. I also agree. I mean, we'll have to see, won't we? But I think there is a way in which those decisions on capital could actually be ultimately in line with this longer term reform agenda. It's obviously because you do need to take tough decisions. Like if you're serious about, alternatives to car transport, that does require tough decisions about roads and likewise with hospitals. I mean, these things are not easy, which is why they haven't been done. So, but that's a sort of highly kind of positive potential that, we're a long way from. And I think ultimately, we need to be making more of a case across the board of a kind of an intent or an ambition to move from what we currently have in terms of some parts of our public service workforce, which are relatively low skill, relatively low pay, social care being one of them, but also childcare, and making a much more powerful case. Ultimately, where we want to get to is for a higher skill, higher pay workforce that lifts up quality and drives all kinds of other positive things in terms of local employment and other things as well. So just some additional thoughts on that.
Cool. Any more questions? Please raise your hand and my colleague will come. We'll take two if there's any more hands. Any more hands? Patty, have you got both of them? And then...
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Mike Colcliffe. I'm just an outsider interested. It would be very easy to be really depressed about what we've heard, this fantastic range of problems facing us. I have a nasty feeling that if you went to any country in Europe, that you could have a similar group of people talking about the problems in Germany, in France, in Italy, and all over the place. So there's two questions. One is is this a bigger thing about Western values and the way we operate? And then the second one is that, I mean, I presume there are some countries that really are doing these things better. So where are they and what can we learn from those?
Great question, Mike. Thank you.
Mohammed Aziz, trustee here, and also do a lot of work in Muslim communities. And Muslim communities are often very deprived communities and rely very heavily on public services. But there's also a lot of resources in Muslim communities in terms of the charitable giving in Muslim communities. They raise about £1 billion every year in the community. There's about 2,000 purpose-built mosques that could be made available for things like youth work. And there's a lot of resources in terms of volunteering. And you've talked, Nick in particular, you've talked about public and private investments, but I'm thinking about third sector investment into the reform and renewal of public services. I just wondered if you'd reflect on that a little bit.
Cool. No, we'll just do those two for now, if that's right. So 2 great questions. Mike's question at the start was about, are these issues unique to the UK, or are they, if you went to France, Germany, Italy, perhaps would you see similar problems? And is there anything we can learn from overseas? And then Mohammed, it's a great question, was about a lot of discussion around involvement of obviously public spending, private capital. What can we be doing to leverage the third pillar a bit better? Thank you, Mohammed. Anyone want to kick us off on those, Catherine?
Yeah, thanks. Really interesting questions. I mean, I think clearly there are issues around kind of, a range of European economies having the same problem of kind of low growth, not matching public spending. But generally, I think there isn't the same levels of problem in terms of crumbling infrastructure. They are kind of higher skill economies, often gone further in terms of renewables than we have. So I think we are a particular problem. And obviously Brexit is relevant there in terms of access to markets and the way that that puts limits to growth as well. I think that where's doing it better is a great question. And, you know, some of that, as I say, we don't need to look beyond the UK to learn lessons and see some good examples, but we know on social care that Germany and Japan have both undertaken major system reforms of social care aimed at kind of bringing more money in, you know, thinking about different kinds of models. So absolutely. And I think generally in terms of that policy learning, that's not something that Whitehall and the UK have generally been very good at. And we need to get much better at saying, you know, we don't need to invent all this here. There are different models in terms of social insurance, you know, versus our approach. So it's not just a kind of drag and drop, but there's clearly lots of learning that could be done. And I think on the question of Muslim communities, I mean, I think, you know, as a resident of Birmingham, I think there's just so much more that we could be doing. It's a city that's kind of financially on its knees, and yet it's got all these kind of great resources in communities. You know, the city council is giving away major assets because it's got to raise money so quickly, and that's just such a tragedy for the kind of future people of the city in terms of sort of how much is going to be cut. So we have to be so kind of creative in thinking, well, you know, if the state resources are going to be so depleted, where are the resources? And I think, you know, you're talking about building-based resources, which will be so scarce, and that there's a kind of opportunity there. So I think that kind of broader piece around, you know, obviously the third sector itself does rely quite heavily on the state, so it's not kind of a simple answer, but there are resources and we need to just be, I think, as creative as possible about making the most of them, particularly in areas where state resources are so constrained.
On the question about sort of how depressing it all sounds. I mean, in some ways, I mean, I think it's quite remarkable the lights are still on in our public service to the extent to which they are. I mean, the amount of pressure they have sustained, and I think it's taken you know, unreasonable levels, to be honest, of public service for many of the people working in our public services to keep them going to the extent to which they have. So that's the sort of one thought that crossed my mind as you were asking it. But I guess, you know, if you think back a few years, I guess what people used to say about this country was that we wanted US level tax rates with European level public services. Obviously, so it's a question of expectations, partly, isn't it? That we sort of want both. And we've kind of got caught between the middle to some extent. Obviously, our relative to our own historical standards, our tax take is higher now than it has been at various points. But, you know, it does come back to those basic dynamics, really, about what, you know, approaches to all kinds of things in terms, including inequalities and contribution and social solidarity and things, which gets quite cultural quite quickly, doesn't it? It gets to be sort of who we are as a country and what we're prepared to do and how we think about these things. But moving on to the sort of the third sector and the voluntary and community sector and the role of faith-based groups within that, I think it's a really important point as well. And I think increasingly what I'm trying to do, and I haven't managed it, I don't think today, but trying to use the word support rather than public services, because I think in many instances it doesn't need to be the state, and in some cases it's better if it's not the state providing that support directly. And in fact, I think it's not even just about resources, and that I mean, I agree that, you know, we need to think expansively about what resources can be deployed given that things are so fiscally challenged, and that could be from the private sector in terms, it can be from the impact economy, you know, sort of social impact investment, and it can also be from communities in the voluntary sector. But I think it's also above and beyond that. I think it's sometimes the right thing to do, that actually that form of support that we were talking about earlier, when people have got something difficult to do in their lives, we actually know that is often very, very well provided for by often absolutely minute organisations, hyper-local organisations in neighbourhoods, in the voluntary and community sector and social enterprises. And so the challenge really is, how does the state interact with those organisations, and how can that relationship be productive? And we've seen some innovations and some creativity there. You know, there's quite a few years of experience with, for instance, alliance contracting, you know, where you have a group of voluntary sector organisations that come together, so there's only one contracting party for local government or another kind of public sector body to have to sort of negotiate and deal with. So, you know, there's plenty other sort of models out there, but I think that's hugely productive and hugely important. And I think the voluntary and community and social enterprise sectors should be considered a core partner along with other partners in terms of public services.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I would really agree with that. I think it'd be a good piece of work for Demos to do, actually, to sort of take stock of what's happened in the voluntary community social enterprise sectors as a consequence of austerity and of COVID, for good and ill. Actually, there were some features of the response to COVID which were very positive, but obviously austerity has kind of completely knocked the stuffing out of lots of the charitable and voluntary sector, and yet thinking about their role in sort of relational public services, in thinking about local public services, in thinking about the provision of particularly innovative services where you want particularly not-for-profits and others to come through and demonstrate new models of doing things. All of these areas I think are really ripe for thinking and for bringing that to bear on the government's agenda. There's a big wide open gap for that, in my view. Just on the issue of comparative performance, there was no question that Britain has suffered relative economic decline since the financial crisis. All of the economic indicators are worse than comparable advanced capitalist economies, and that is the main reason why our public services are under such pressure and strain. And until we fix those problems of weak productivity, low growth, and high inequality, all of the public sector will be under pressure still, because it's having to pick up lots of problems in the wider society with fewer resources to do it. So we have got to address our relative economic decline, and in a sense, the kind of whole positioning of the new Labour government is kind of indicative of that understanding. But of course, we can learn from other countries. I mean, absolutely, and it's a real problem when you're parochial about what you do and you don't look to elsewhere. You have to recognise, though, that you have national institutions that have a history that evolve over time. And therefore, if you are learning from other places, you do so within your own national institutional context. So if you look at, I don't know, early years services in Scandinavia, which are the best in the world, you think about how you would then undertake the kind of building of those services in a British context, or in a Scottish context, or a Welsh context. So understanding different national contexts is very important, even though it's really, really critical to be open and curious and inquisitive about what works everywhere else.
Thank you. Put your hand up if you want to ask a question. We've got one at the back. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Gary Austin, Circle Indigo Involved. You've all kind of mentioned citizen engagement and public participation. So it's kind of a quick twofold question. How encouraged are you by the fact that you've now got new intake MPs like Georgia Gould, former leader of Labour, former leader for Camden Council, heavily an advocate of both citizen engagement, public participation in the Cabinet Office as a new MP? And secondly, if there was to be a UK-wide Citizens' Assembly permanent, as they now have in France, what do you think individually should be the topic in public service that they should address first?
Cool. Were there any more hands? Oh yes. Oh, 2 Demos researchers. Let's pit them against each other.
I'm asking on behalf of the online audience.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
very selfless.
James McCormick says, how far should bundle devolution deals be brought forward? So, for example, affordable housing, capital expenditure, in tandem with early years and local public transport progress, rather than services in silos.
Can you read that one again?
Yeah.
Jim McCormick.
So it's about should devolution deals bring together the like social public services like early years services with perhaps what we might describe as more economic so things like affordable housing expenditure, that kind of thing.
Great techie question. Sophia, do you want to ask your question as well?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I'm going to be very selfish and ask a very me-focused question. So, as Ben knows, I work on our tech policy team. I was really struck by Halima's phrase, the kind of the idea you're going to get kind of new public management through the back door. I kind of wonder with some of the discourses around efficiency, AI, kind of as a cost-saving mechanism, do you see that as a kind of vector of some of that influence being kind of imposed top down? And do you think, any of the panelists, that there's a role for kind of technology in some of the kind of visions you're seeing of public service reform, or do you think it's a bit of a threat as it currently stands? Thank you.
What a range of questions. So we have Sophia's question around is the nightmare of NPM looming in a sort of AI utopianist form. Question from the online audience about should we be, I guess devolution to combined authorities in England is kind of focused on economic policy thus far. Should we be broadening that to public services and or social policy? And then the final question the first question from the back was about citizenship and participation. So what topic you would have a standing citizens assembly on? Anyone want to kick us off on any of those?
I'm happy just to cherry pick the bits that I know about. I mean, in terms of a citizens' assembly, let's have it on social care. Obviously, I would say that because that's what I'm interested in. But actually, I think it's a great topic because it covers so many different areas. It's not a kind of techie topic. It's about kind of what is a good life for people as they age, people with disabilities, unpaid carers. So I think, it is a very inclusive topic. Half of us will be a carer for an adult by the time we're 50. So it's not a kind of thing that happens over there. It is something that's really mainstream. So I think that could be a great topic for a citizens' assembly. And then in terms of the devolution deals, I mean, I think great to be thinking what's possible to devolve, but I guess just with a couple of caveats. One is that not everywhere is covered by a devolution deal. As I said, that they were only looking at kind of half the population, so we need to kind of make sure that this isn't something where some people are kind of getting access to something kind of new and shiny and exciting and other people aren't. And then also we do need to think a little bit, I think, about what are these combined authorities and how far are they kind of communities that people can identify with and that sort of speak for an area. I think Greater Manchester has done a really good job in developing a kind of an identity around that and a high profile mayor. The West Midlands Combined Authority does not have that same kind of profile and sense of identity. The West Midlands authorities are much more kind of diverse and don't necessarily even like each other, let alone the combined authorities. So, so I do think this kind of, if we're taking people along on a journey, these have to be kind of units that people kind of identify and think, yes, I'm kind of part of the West Midlands, and I think that is a bit more of a difficult sell.
So on the first question about citizen participation, Yeah, I mean, I in fact, I worked with Georgia Gould in London because I was at the GLA at the time. So I think it's hugely positive that she's made that move. And in fact, many of the issues we've been talking about across this whole agenda, I mean, she's absolutely fluent in and has led that kind of change. So yeah, I think it'd be really interesting to see how that plays out and the role that she plays. Social care funding would also get my vote for the first topic for this permanent citizens' assembly. On the bundled devolution deals, yeah, I think that's a really interesting question because up to this point, there's been quite an economic lens to devolution, hasn't there? So I think it's the right moment really for the more sort of socially orientated agendas to be part of it. And I think there's this back to, again, those things we were saying about sort of silos and moving away from silos and getting more citizen centered. I mean, all that stuff with childcare and all the rest of it needs to be part of the devolution deals for that to be possible. And we know that actually there's great local models of childcare, for instance, that are less extractive, that are less on the sort of profiteering end of things, and much there's many different possible kind of approaches that can be taken, and that's easier to do at the local level. So yeah, I think there's a strong case for that. And on AI and efficiency, I'm also of the sort of keeping technology, reminding ourselves that technology is a tool, sometimes an extremely powerful tool, but a tool nonetheless. So I would always take a kind of workforce, kind of think of it from the workforce perspective first. And it needs to be, to my mind, it needs to be in tandem with this kind of higher valued, higher motivated workforce that are then kind of supported to take on the tool. So that way around. But you're absolutely right. The threat is that it's absolutely the opposite way around. And we just need to keep remaking the case on that, I think. But the forces are quite strong for the kind of tech utopia that sort of pushes everybody else out of the way and doesn't necessarily deliver either. So yeah, the risks are real.
Yeah, thanks very much. Just on Jim McCormick's question on the social and the economic in devolution deals. I mean, it's absolutely true that housing development and urban planning, transport have big effects on health and other outcomes. So, how you build, whether you build healthy places connected to public transport rather than car use with green spaces, all of those things matter for health outcomes. So it's really important to think of it in those terms, even if formally the combined authorities don't have responsibility for the NHS or don't have responsibility for schools and all the rest of it. There is a particular techie bit, which is on Section 106 agreements, which is typically used to pay for social and affordable housing and for things like leisure centres. I think we could be thinking of, given that there is so much resting on building 300,000 houses a year or housing units a year and needing private developers to do that we need to think about how the Section 106 funding that flows from that community investment levy, how these things go into social purposes. I would like, for example, children's centres built out of Section 106 funding in disadvantaged communities. I think that would be a good way of getting capital mobilised into those sorts of priorities for public services. So Jim's right to ask that question. On combined authority, on citizens' assemblies, I mean, the main issue is how you dock back into formal public policy decision making, obviously, and that's a big challenge to deliberative Democrats. I would like to see a sort of permanent citizens' assembly probably done first at a combined authority level. I mean, I think that would be really good innovation if that were to happen. For national areas, I mean, I would like to see a bit of lib-lab cooperation on social care, actually. I just think there are good reasons for it. But if part of that can be deliberative, great. Otherwise, things like assisted dying, it seems to me those sorts of areas are really ripe for those approaches showing that they can really work. And on the tech issue, yeah, I mean, technology is socially constructed. It doesn't kind of land from outside. I do think there's lots of innovation and improvement that can take place through the deployment of different technologies, even if I'm skeptical of the claims made by the AI fairy. But I would like to see a stress on the public sector having its own capabilities. I mean, I was always very attracted to the kind of Barcelona digital sovereignty idea, that you need to kind of not just think about what you're buying in or taking from contractors, but your own capabilities within the public sector and public services for designing, developing, and opening out your digital technologies in particular. So that's something I think that needs thinking about.
Thank you, Nick. I think we've got time for one final round of questions. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand. We're going to take these two at the front here. Oh, sorry. Thanks.
My question is related to the shift towards prevention. So I think it would be fair to say that so far it's been more of a push on the part of ambitious local authorities, combined authorities like Gateshead, like the Community Solutions model in Barking and Dagenham, or No Wrong Door in Fife in Scotland. But those have been the exception rather than the norm to successfully transition to prevention-oriented services. So what do you see the appetite from this government, or the ambition for this government, to help transition from a push from those authorities to a more of a pull to ensure that the rest of the system actually successfully transforms into prevention-oriented services and institutions?
Thank you. Mike Salem from the Consumer Choice Centre. My question is, Wes Streeting went to Singapore in December and he seemed quite keen when he came back on some things over there. So my question to the panel is, what do you think will happen in that regard in the future? Do you think we'll see mandatory saving schemes? What sorts of reform are we going to see from Wes Streeting? Will the private sector come in and help waiting lists? Thank you.
Cool. Okay. So a question on prevention, and how do we go from how do we really shift the dial on prevention, and then a question around what do we expect from Wes? Is he going to go? I mean, Singapore on Thames means something else, doesn't it? But what's are there lessons from Singapore, from the NHS? I'm not an expert on Singapore and the NHS, so I don't feel the need to answer if you're not, Catherine.
I'm going to pick the first question because I don't know the answer to the second question. And I think you're right. There's some local authorities are doing great stuff around prevention. I think what's interesting, though, is that sort of while kind of some local authorities and some parts of local authorities are taking the kind of no wrong door approach, which I think is sort of it almost like sums up the kind of broader approach to prevention. Lots of authorities that we've to work with are kind of working quite hard to say, this is the wrong door. This door has got no money. You cannot come through this door. So, for example, on our local health and wellbeing board in Birmingham, we had the police come along and say, we will no longer be going out to mental health call outs. And this is something that I think began with the Met. And that is a no wrong door. And now it's clearly not ideal for that the police is, it's not that, we wouldn't necessarily think that the police are the best people to respond to mental health crisis, but they're often the only people to respond at that point. So, we can see the same kind of cost shunting between health and social care around kind of whose problem something is, who's paying for this. Is it continuing healthcare package? Is it social care? So I think there's a lot of, really kind of recognition that that some of this kind of preventative work is really important. But actually, I think what we're seeing in cash-strapped local authorities or local public service systems is quite a lot of shutting of doors. And so clearly there's got to be some kind of investment, but there has also got to be, I think, some thinking much more kind of about cross-service systems. And I think, there was some indication that that's something that in the Treasury papers yesterday they want to think more about, which I think is positive.
So on prevention, I think it's a great question, and I think it's exactly right to frame it in terms of a transition. And as you say, it's a really major transition, and it remains the exception. So I think that's absolutely right. I think there might be sort of a couple of different parts to it. One is, I think there's some stuff that could be done at the national level in terms of not just making the case for investment, but redefining investment categories. Demos has done some work and has argued for a new investment category, which I think is really useful and valuable. So there's some stuff, if you like, on the hard wiring of how money flows through the system and how it's kind of categorized. I think there's more stuff to be done there. But I think also I think it's one of those things that I'm going to go back to Nick's point earlier about kind of experimentation and innovation in the system. So some work I did last year was around the idea of social R&D. So bringing a sort of an R&D or R&I, if you like, but R&D approach to innovation in public services, and treat it as seriously as we treat R&D in commercial and scientific the worlds, which is that, new approaches are dramatically different, don't just magically make their way around a system, even if that's in a sort of commercial or scientific setting. So why should they in a public service setting? We seem to think that just because something sort of happens in somewhere like Gateshead, just magically everyone else is going to do it. But that's not how other sort of parts of the economy or whatever work. So I think there might be some things that we can learn from bringing a kind of an R&D lens to how this stuff gets kind of taken up and learnt and adapted to elsewhere, because it is, I think, a set of approaches that lends itself well to bottom-up experimentation. Not to say that we can't, nothing can be learnt from anywhere, and there's nothing, I think, it's one of those things where there can be clear principles, where people can be, clear about what sort of happened elsewhere. There can even be sort of evidence flowing around the system, but these things might well need to be created in context, in situ, to meet the particular kind of context that they're sort of working in. And so to help that along, I think what would be fantastic would be, for instance, a much more of a case for a learning and improvement system. I guess I sort of mentioned that earlier, but realizing that often, if you're not, if you know that Gateshead's done this amazing stuff, which they have, do take a look if you haven't already, and you're in a different local authority and you like the sound of it, it's a huge lift, heavy lifting to then work out, well, what does that mean for us here? We're in a completely different part of the country, politically might be completely different. So having a kind of some kind of additional capacity that you can draw on, that can kind of walk you along the journey, that might provide, it could be called an innovation capabilities, or it could be called a learning capability or improvement. We know a fair amount about the role of improvement in the health system, for example. So applying those sorts of things to this kind of field, I think, could be quite productive. And in amongst all of that, there might well be some new intermediary type organisations that kind of help places to go along their own journey, if you like, that they need to go on to make that shift, which, as we say, is not straightforward to achieve.
Yeah, I really agree with everything that Halima said there. All I would say is that I think, we do have a lot of evidence on what works in prevention, particularly for children and families, and the biggest challenge is then, shifting your services and systems across into prevention, services or interventions. Probably, I think, in addition to what Halima's just said about learning and sort of advisory services that might help with this, we should probably try to persuade the Treasury to configure a cross-cutting review of local public services and locals, picking up on what was in the papers yesterday about local ecosystems, that enable you then to address that question of shifting over time into prevention. So that could be part of the comprehensive spending review. I think that'd be a very good thing. Just quickly on Singapore, Singapore is very interesting. Like other former British colonial city-states, it owns all its land, so it can massively do what it wants on housing and generate tax revenues from it. It's a managed democracy, so the state can tell lots of people what to do, but it pays its civil servants incredibly well, and it's very, very good at strategy. Okay, it's a very, very strategic government, always has been in Singapore since it became an independent state. So there are things that you can't learn from it, but there are things that you might be able to too. And it has done also an incredible job with e-government services and digital technology and all of that, and is one of the exemplars of that kind of approach. So, if Wes Streeting is going against some inspiration from there, that's probably not a bad thing. But I come back to the point I made earlier that, we're a very different national context, different national institutions, a whole different way of funding and providing services. So you have to think about where those innovations can be learnt from, how they are applied in a very different local and national settings in the UK.
Cool. Well, we are at time. Thank you so much to everyone for coming along. I hope you join me in giving a warm round of applause to our speakers. Thank you. Thank you, guys. It was very good. Enjoyed that.
Yeah, it's very enjoyable. Yeah,
I'm very impressed.